welcome to In Their Voices. Today, I have a chance to have a conversation with John Ford. John, talk a little bit about, introduce yourself to the viewers, please.
Thanks, Michael. As everyone discovers the minute I start talking, I have an accent, and then I like pointing out to them they have one too.
That's right.
I'm originally from South Africa, and I've been in the United States since 1996. I started out in Southern Africa as an attorney, and it was as an attorney practicing in Namibia that I got my start in mediation, not in the sense that I took a training in mediation, but more that I discovered that I was inclined towards mediation and helping people to work out their differences on their own. And the two primary areas that I focused on and I've continued to track in my career were workplace and family. In the family context, the wife would come in and say she'd want a civil divorce, and her husband would go off and see another attorney, and all hell would break loose. So what I started doing was saying, why don't you invite your husband into the office and we'll work things out in private. And I didn't really realize that I was mediating then, but I was. And same actually I always had an interest in labor and employment law, and started sitting as chairperson of conciliation boards when the union and the company were in dispute. And again, I didn't have any training, but I realized in hindsight that that was really the start of my mediation practice. And when I came to the United States, I formally trained and was then sort of trying to figure out how I was going to grow my practice. And one of the realizations I had was that if I was going to practice in the legal arena, I'd have to take the bar exam, practice as an attorney, gain credibility with attorneys who were essentially the gatekeepers to the mediations. And that just somehow wasn't something that excited me. And someone mentioned this idea, or that ideally what we should be doing is swimming upstream away from the courthouse, and that all of the disputes that arrive at the courthouse have their inception much, much earlier on, and there were always missed opportunities. And I saw that clearly actually as a contract mediator with the EEOC, where there was always a sense of missed opportunity prior to them arriving in the actual mediation. And in many senses, that's been my sort of career and practice, has been focusing on mediation at the early stages. So I've worked a lot with human resource professionals, just business leaders that were able to recognize the starts of the conflicts that, left unattended, would fester and mature into horrible disputes that would need to go into that legal system. And that's really where I focused, primarily on the classic mediation, say between two employees, but also increasingly I do a lot of work with teams in trouble. And along the way, I also trained as a trainer. So in addition to my mediation practice, I've always been providing what I just sort of describe as soft skills training: communication, negotiation, dealing with difficult people, emotional intelligence, customer service, things like that. And increasingly also training human resource professionals to mediate themselves. But that really has been my, I suppose, the sort of the focus of my practice and what I do, Michael.
You know, as I was listening to you describe how you arrived at doing mediation,
Mm-hmm.
what occurs to me is that we all have a story to tell, some more interesting than others.
Mm-hmm.
Yours is a very interesting one, not the least because you changed continents
Mm-hmm.
in the process of developing your career. But it also says something to me about the way in which you think about conflict and the people in conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And the connection then from doing the work, being the expert in the room, so to speak, has now led you also to be training other people to have the skills to manage their own disputes on their own, so that they only contact you for intervention when they have exhausted their abilities, rather
Yes.
than just at the first instance throwing up their hands and saying, we don't know what to do.
Yes, Michael. I think ideally we empower people to take care of their conflict themselves. And I think creating dependencies where we sort of offer this mysterious process that no one really knows what we do, but somehow we manage to get them to the other side, and they look around and they say they have an agreement. That can be nice at times and exactly what people sometimes need. But generally, I think the sort of the call or the need in our world is to, as I say, to empower people to deal with their conflicts themselves. And that means that they need to understand a little bit more the process that they're going through. So certainly when I'm mediating, I try to put a lot of focus on training them just before they go into the mediation as to sort of what to expect, and to talk about what it is, what it means for a human being to be in conflict, but also to contextualize the choices that people have. So it's less about me administering some kind of arcane, as I say, mysterious process, and me being the supporter of them and their conversation and helping them to work through their differences on their own with my support.
Yeah. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you do that, how you work with parties to prepare them to participate in mediation.
Well, one area that I've really changed the way that I practice is in regards to my opening statement. One of my realizations is I kept reflecting on what I was doing in the sort of what I would sort of see as the classic opening statement. I realized a lot of it was actually meeting my needs and was really more mediator focused. A lot of the confidentiality language is all about protecting me from not being subpoenaed and all of that good kind of stuff. And I think I don't want to discount that, because that is really important. But what I've tried to do is to shift a little bit more to focusing and supporting the participants where they are, both in terms of their sort of emotional state, but also trying to meet them where they are in terms of their sort of their skill capacity. And so what I now do is I often, I suppose I still call it my mediator's opening statement, but it's really more of an orientation slash kind of training, where I talk, as I say, I talk to them about what it means to be in conflict. I try to normalize the inevitability of there being ruptures in any relationship. I use I do a lot of charting as well when I do this, because another sort of allied realization has been that the dominant sense for most humans is sight, and yet the practice of mediation is almost not exclusively but predominantly auditory. So we all sit around the table and listen to one another, which is fine. And I see the benefit of being visually displaying and storyboarding for the participants kind of what's going on. So typically when I start my mediation, well, almost always my sort of stock opening is to look to both. If it's two or if it's a team, I'll try and make contact with everyone and say to them, I'm here for all of you. And that to me is sort of very sort of a deep part of what I believe of that mediator's posture of we don't come to the mediation process to take sides. We come to support everyone. And then the other thing I like to tell them or to say to them, my intention is to do no harm. But after that, almost invariably, what I'll do is I'll draw a big circle on the whiteboard or a chart, and use that as a reference for a relationship that's complete and whole. And then I rub out a little section of that circle, and it leaves me with the letter C, and I say, you see, sometimes we have breaches, we have ruptures in our relationship. And the dilemma and the tragedy often is that as humans, we try to restore that unity, but we don't know how to go about doing it. And so we may say something like, you're rude, you never, never let me finish saying, you never let me finish saying what I want to say. Well, if you start out like that and you say to someone, you're rude like that, chances are they're going to take that as an attack and get defensive. So as I'm doing this, what I'm really trying to do is to normalize it for folks and to help them to see how they themselves have sort of fallen into that trap of being judgmental, being critical, blaming, pointing the finger, all of that good kind of stuff, or just sometimes closing down. But I'm able to identify those then as the bad behaviors that don't help repair the rupture to that circle whose unity has been broken. And then I start pointing out the kind of behaviors that are going to be more helpful. And the one I'll sort of talk to is the importance of listening, and do a very quick review of what it means to be an a reflective, active listener, and emphasize the importance of demonstrating understanding. And that doesn't mean agreement, and that starts to put them a little at ease, because they're thinking, well, I may be able to hear what this person's saying, but I definitely don't agree with them. And I'm saying that's fine. In other words, when we're a good listener, we're just letting the other person know we've heard them, not that we've agreed with them. And then I also talk a little bit about how we can go about expressing ourselves using I statements, and through that identify the sort of the positive benefit of being able to articulate both what we're feeling and needing. But that essentially, though, just as sort of coming back to your sort of question of how I've shifted things, I'd say that's been one of my biggest areas of change, is to say doing an opening statement, more of a training where I'm engaging them, getting them as I said, to think about what it means to be in conflict, and then also talk a little bit about their choices, the skills they need. And then right at the end, I'll wrap it up. I'll typically sort of sit down with them, and I'll take them through the agreement to mediate, and we'll sign that. But that's is a relatively short percentage of the time that I spend engaging with them during that opening/orientation session that I do up front.
John, I noted appreciatively how you described beginning, because those few words are so different and have an impact. I'm here for all of you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which immediately places you in the circle with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't keep you outside as the expert, but it doesn't compromise your expertise.
Exactly, yes.
It doesn't say, I don't know what I'm doing here. It just says, I know what I'm doing here, and I'm here with you to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In fact, if I can say, I'm not sure if you'll see, but I have a gesture that goes along with it, which is my hands open like this. And so at the beginning, I'll say, I'm here for all of you. And as I say, I'll try and make eye contact. And then I'll sometimes warn the participants. I'll say, if you see me putting my hands out, that's to remind you I'm here for all of you. And it'll often happen as we're going through the mediation. My arms will fling out as a gesture of just to remind them that's my job. My job's not to take sides, but to support them all.
Well, and it reminds them that they're there together, that they have a common purpose as well as individual experiences.
Yes, exactly. That
Wow.
we're all in it, and that's so another way in which I'll, in a similar sort of fashion, I'll sometimes sort of, as I'm doing that orientation, really sort of will talk to them as if we're going on a journey. So I'll sort of say things like, we're going on a journey together to talk about your conflict, to discover what's important to each of you about it, and to see if there's a solution that we can find that works for everyone. So yes, we're all in it together.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to ask, I mean, I've got many things I would love to ask you about this, John. It's just fascinating. But one that occurs to me is that some people who listen to you are likely to say, um, but John, that takes too much time. People won't sit still for doing that. They came to get a job done and they want to get the job finished. How do you manage the process in a way so that the parties don't have that kind of reaction? Or if they do, you're able to help them be patient and focused and connected.
Well, you're right. I mean, I've found though that the time is generally well spent. If there's any resistance to it, it sometimes comes more from the administrative sort of side of folks that are helping to set it up, where they're wondering about the value of spending so much time in a, as it were, in a orientation / kind of little training piece. But what I found consistently is that once I have them, I sort of entrain them into my mediator field, but that I engage with them in a way that they're, I don't say captivated, but it's that sort of thing about adult learning, where when you're sharing adult learners, information that's relevant to their situation, then it's alive for them. So again, if I'm talking and they're listening to me, sort of explaining the agreement to mediate and starting to sound a little legalistic, that's when I notice them starting to tune out. When I'm telling them, when I'm drawing a circle and talking about conflict and ruptures and how we get defensive, typically the response that I get from them later on was how helpful that was and how they resonated with that. But that said, in other words, there's still sometimes I'll encounter folks that maybe have a posture of resistance. They've kind of come in where they just have that mindset of, I don't really want to participate. And then I think, like with anything in mediation, we always have to be attentive to what's presenting to us, to ourselves in the moment. And then I will adjust, in other words, and maybe change track, or maybe speed up a little bit, or try and do something a little bit differently. But I've found in general is that people actually find it very relevant. Another sort of analogy would be, imagine if, I don't know, I suspect maybe, Michael, you've scuba dived?
Long time ago, but yeah.
Okay, a long
Yes,
time ago. But I bet before you went scuba diving, you didn't want to just someone to say, here's the tank, here's the mask, there's the ocean, jump in, right?
that's right.
And then put a lot of emphasis on, here's the indemnity that I want you to sign, right?
Correct.
And so to me, you'd want that instructor to take the time to prepare you for success, so that you felt safe and that you were being cared for appropriately. So that's where I'm putting my attention and my energy. And again, I hadn't thought of that before, but less on that indemnity, which I think is more akin to our agreement to mediate. So I find that they're getting information that's relevant to them, that's being presented to them in an engaging manner. And again, especially with the use of charting and visual sort of diagrams that sort of help to bring it to life, I find they actually enjoy it. I think there's another funny little piece to the puzzle, that as people come into the conflict situation, they're typically nervous, they're uncertain about what to expect and how it's going to be. And I'm sort of putting them at ease. Then I'm not putting them on the spot, and they're able to just sort of sit back and just be with me. So I found it generally I found it to be a productive time, and that I don't really pick up much open resistance to it, or even sense that people are tuning out. I have the sense generally that people are engaged and are appreciating the relevance of the information that's actually geared towards empowering them to be able to have the conversation themselves.
And when you speak with people afterward about the experience,
Mm-hmm.
you said that they're very favorable toward it.
Yes.
They found it valuable.
Yes.
In how do they connect what you did with their experience as well as the outcome? And I don't, by outcome, I mean the personal sense of outcome, not just what's written down on a piece of paper. How do they talk about that?
Well, what I'll typically, so just to quickly say, so in terms of my what I sort of think of as, and I sometimes refer to it as my Cadillac process, would be, I would typically start with that sort of orientation that I was describing / opening statement. I also, by the way, if there's a leader that's responsible for the two employees, have them come to that initial meeting as well. And then after that, I'll typically have one-on-one time with each of them. So that's really a pre-mediation caucus where I'm having a one-on-one confidential conversation. And that's where I'll often get sort of some of that feedback that you're asking about. So sometimes people will say yes. They'll sometimes, in the safety of our conversation, own and say things like, "Yeah, I have been a little critical," and I can so they'll often reflect using my language or my model on their experience. And another thing which I sort of, as I was saying, I also address are their choices. And I always present to the participants, almost in a riddle-like fashion. I sort of say to them, how do humans move on from the pain of the past? And to my mind, that's a conversation that's not just exclusive to mediators. I think of all of humanity actually grapples and thinks about something like that at some point in time. And what I articulate for them, as I say, essentially there's three paths that humans take. Well, the one is they seek justice. They say if someone can be held accountable and there's some or other typically negative consequence, and I see them, justice served, as it were, then I'll be able to move on. And that certainly is one path that's open. But I also point out to them that I don't offer that. That's not what I offer. Then that's really much more of a fact-finding process, but it's not something that I offer. The other path that I point to is forgiveness. And I also point out again to them that I don't expect or require them to forgive, but I always just like to mention that that's another way in which humans are able to move beyond the pain of the past. It doesn't mean they condone what happened, doesn't mean they forget it, but they find it within themselves to no longer expect the past to be different. And then finally, I mention reconciliation as a path, and I spell out in more detail what I understand by reconciliation, and again, also in a way that enables them to feel like it's their conversation. So it's often in regard to, in addition to sometimes them being contrite and owning maybe that they haven't been as skilled as they could have been in navigating their conflict, but they'll often reflect on that choice, and they'll sometimes ruminate out loud about forgiveness and things like that, even though I'm not expecting that, but I find it helpful just to get them thinking, about that, or saying things like, I don't want revenge, but I do want this to stop. I'm really unhappy with the way my manager's been treating me, and it's got to stop. But I don't want them to lose their job. So I find that we're able to have a more mature, and then I would say also, to me, this is the sort of a big significant part of it, is a conversation where they're less trying to enlist me as their advocate, or sort of to take their side, and also less likely to be in what I would sort of describe as full-blown victimhood status. In other words, they're starting to appreciate that they have a responsibility in the situation, that it's not always about blaming someone else and me coming in to take their side and put this other person in place. So my sense typically is that they're able to, as it were, up their game, have a more mature conversation about what's going on, to see it in a more normal, as I say, context. In other words, not as if they, as humans, have somehow failed themselves. And here's another little thing that I often find that they'll comment on, that they seem to find helpful, is I refer to the research of John Gottman, the psychologist up in Seattle, who I always think he came to fame courtesy of Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink. But John Gottman's the guy with the Love Lab that predicts around about 95, or something, I think it's 90 to 95% accuracy whether a couple will stay together or not. And he identifies sort of 4 troubling behaviors that he calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, that are present in troubled marriages. That's criticism, the emotion of contempt, stonewalling, and defensivenveness. But he also has this little statistic that I find really resonates with people. He says that in marriages, and I'm always at points to say, of course, I'm not suggesting that you're married, but as you know, the workplace is a little bit like the family, and we spend a lot of time together. But he found that in marriages, the couple are able to resolve, in an absolute sense, 33% of their issues. The rest of them are what he calls perpetual problems. And so that's 67%. And so just by mentioning that, so now we're having a conversation, and they'll be saying things like, well, there's some issues that we, as you were saying, that we'll be able to resolve. But the way I look at it is, we're always going to have tension around punctuality, because I'm a J and he's a P, thinking of Myers Briggs.
Right.
So that's going to be a perpetual problem for us, and we're going to have to work something out. But so again, instead of them looking at their issues as problems, they're starting to look at them as their opportunities. And that's certainly my rallying cry, is constantly saying to them, everything that you present to me as a problem, as an issue, what am I going to call it? Eventually, by the end of the mediation, they're all like, oh, an opportunity. And they do start eventually getting there. So again, I find that each in a different way, and each person will meet me depending on where they are in their life, and also their capacity for self-reflection, their willingness to look in their mirror, to own their contribution, but each conversation will be different. But I find it's a much richer conversation that I'm having with them than the conversations that I previously had when my opening statement, as I say, was more geared towards my needs of protecting me and a little throwing in a little bit about my role and what have you. But primarily it was really about my safety as the mediator and not putting my energy and attention into supporting them where they are on their lives, literally needing to have a conflict resolution conversation with this other human being in which they're going to be supported. And that I never know where I somewhere along the way I thought it was Jim Malamud's quote, where they sometimes people say mediation is assisted negotiation, and another sort of variation of that I sometimes think of is just to say mediation is assisted conflict resolution. But that always reminds me to stay, in other words, in my lane, and that it's not my conflict. I'm just there to help them, and I don't want to be the magician that comes in and changes things around and they're like, oh good, we've resolved it, but how on earth did we do that? I'm more for the process where they have a sense of agency in their own conflict, and they're able to make sense of why we're doing what we're doing and see how the process unfolds, ultimately to them getting some kind of a satisfactory resolution.
As I listen to your descriptions, John, not only is the process interesting because it's unique to you,
Mm-hmm.
as well as different from the way many people manage an introduction. But I don't want to focus so much on the technique, although it is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting to me is that you have a clear sense of why you do what you do, that it isn't just some clever idea that you came up with. It isn't just reactive to circumstances where you had either a positive or a negative experience. Not only do you have a sense of why you do what it is that you do, you're informing the parties of why you're doing what it is that you do so that they can understand the rationale for the behavior and not just have the experience of the behavior, the interaction with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I think when you sort of share that, Michael, what it sort of brings up for me is how, as mediators, we shouldn't be patronizing to the people that we're working with. In other words, that we need to be respectful of their lived experience. That conflict, again, using that analogy of scuba diving, a lot of people go through life and they don't scuba dive. But I don't think any human goes through life and doesn't experience a conflict.
Right.
So they all have that experience. So I would never want to sort of demean or minimize their experience. And again, I think for me, one of the things I'm really grateful for on my path was that decision to get into training more, and I got a certificate in training, and I found that tremendously helpful, because just learning about adult learning theory and how humans, especially as adults, learn, I think a lot of what I've done has been actually informed by that body of knowledge, and that sort of belief that where a human is having a particular kind of an experience, like they're in a conflict, the best thing we can do is to empower them and support wherever they may be, to have to engage themselves, as I say. And that's why I keep coming back to that sort of idea of, I don't want to be the one that does it for them. It's a little like, also another analogy would be to think of the physical healing profession, because a physical doctor can very seldom, maybe with some surgery, sometimes they can say, well, I stitched you up. Well, they may have stitched you up, but then you come back a few days later to see how your body has healed. And fundamentally, healing is that same sort of kind of a process, is that they're people that will support and encourage you to take things, to do things, but ultimately we heal ourselves. And I think it's my same belief when it comes to conflict, is that people, they resolve their conflicts themselves. It's not us, the mediator. And as much as I I do like to be informed by, like just as I mentioned a little earlier, that piece around the visual aspect of things. There's a little bit of, you could sort of just say, science behind that, in the sense that we know the dominant sense for all humans is sight. They also say sometimes when we break up learners as to whether they're visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, the largest group is the visual learners. So to me, that sort of move towards more graphic recording and demonstrating and showing people things was definitely informed by that. Actually, I can share another, a colleague of ours, David Stein at Liaise Divorce Solutions in San Francisco. So when he does his divorces, and for a while I worked with him doing divorces in downtown San Francisco. But after the intake, at our very first session, we'd use projectors and would have the marital settlement agreement on the screen, so that people could literally see that. So again, that was informed by that sort of same insight. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for us, to challenge some of the, I suppose, the old practices where we've just always done it a certain way, and we have tremendous access to science and just sort of, I suppose, intuitive wisdom that we can use to adapt our practices. And again, I think that's the other discovery I've had as a mediator, is that we don't all mediate exactly the same way. Everyone's got their own unique signature, as it were. And so maybe mine's a little bit one that's there where I have a stronger blend of the training piece that I infuse into my mediation process, which is going to be a little bit different from someone who's maybe a more directive mediator.
Well, but it's not just, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish style,
Mm-hmm.
which is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
people have told me in the past, for example, that I have a perfect mediator's voice,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm quiet, and I said, that's exactly right. I use it to lull people to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
craft the agreement, and when they wake up, it's all done.
There you go.
But that's style. That is,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't do that because I have a philosophy. I do that because that's who I am. I have a good friend who is very playful, and he uses humor
Mm-hmm.
because that's who he is,
Yes.
not because he's necessarily trying to conceptualize the value of humor and so on, in the resolution of conflict. So I see that your idea, or I wonder if your idea about training doesn't have not only something that's part of you that you enjoy doing it, but conceptually, philosophically, theoretically, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
um, it has a place in your mediation because it fits into a larger view that you have
Yes.
of what it is that you do.
Yes. Definitely. And I think that said, though, I would say though that you're right that we all have our unique sort of styles and things like that. And then I also think there are certain ways in which it sort of behooves us to show up. In other words, that we can, for example, there's a little video that I watched, a TED talk the other day was actually more about a guy he was really focusing on presentations. And his big sort of pitch was saying to people, you don't want to see the authentic me, because if you saw the authentic me, you wouldn't like me. And so as a presenter, I'm doing things to engage you. So for example, he was talking about the value of smiling. And in his speech, he spoke a little bit about, I suppose, neuroscience, and was saying how on meeting a new human being, we're monitoring to see, is this person a friend or a foe? And there's certain things that we can do that are going to incline the person to see us as being more friendly and than hostile. And so in a certain sense, I think, yes, I would say I like to think I show up because I actually think we do need to be authentic as the real me showing up. but there are things that I am going to be doing that I know are going to be helpful. Like even like that, like say my gesture like that, and me looking at people. Those are me. Those are some of the would almost sort of say my trained behaviors that I've done and seen how they've been beneficial, and so continue to do them. And I'd say that much I would say has been very true to my practice, is the continual tweaking, trying things, seeing the result, seeing it was beneficial, and then suddenly I'll get some little bit of a feedback where I'll be, oh, and then I'll be, oh, I've got a little learning here. I need to be careful about that, adjust something. So because I do think there's a strong body of knowledge that we all mediators can draw on, so like, for example, your voice, just like you were commenting on. I've also heard I've had similar comments about my voice, and I think there's certain voices that are probably more suited to or more conducive to helping people work things out. So everyone has to come with that, and I suppose to some extent still staying within your authentic sort of lane, adjust your behavior, and again I'd say in service of the participants, helping them to sort of as I keep saying, to empower them to be able to be the ones to navigate their conflict.
Well, the whole process is iterative.
Mm-hmm.
We're always paying attention to what's happening for
Mm-hmm.
for the people in the room
Mm-hmm.
and responding to that, making
Yes.
adjustments. But John, if I may, and I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to make this into a microanalysis,
Mm-hmm.
but what I would say is that the gesture of opening your arms
Mm-hmm.
and speaking of inclusivity is not just a gesture. It's a well-considered behavior that has its basis in your view about your role as a mediator and how you engage with participants so that they can be
Yes.
fully,
Yes. Yes.
they can be fully present and participant in
Yes.
the process.
Yes. 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 And I'm constantly trying to tweak and change and find new ways, new things that I can do to engage people. And I'd say a lot of the time it's not even at a conscious level, but at a subconscious level, to prime them literally to be able to be effective in addressing and having their conversation about their conflict. And so there are a whole lot of little elements, little things that I am doing intentionally, that are all geared towards that net result. And so yeah, definitely
And we,
that's in there with them.
because we could have a number of people who share the same fundamental values that you do,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and their behaviors would be different because they're unique people.
Yes.
I think that I share your view about the inclusivity,
Mm-hmm.
because to me that's fundamentally what self-determination means.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
isn't informed consent that I know what I'm signing when I get to the end and I agree. It really means that I am engaged fully as a human being,
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
all of my dignity intact,
Mm-hmm.
with all of my mental capacities and emotional capacities activated. I'm
Mm-hmm.
fully engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the behaviors that I use that isn't this gesture,
Mm-hmm.
um, is I stop repeatedly and say, what questions do you have about what
Mm-hmm.
we're doing here? Or how is this working for you?
Mm-hmm.
Are we making progress? How are you feeling? Are we doing things that are helpful to you? Is there anything that we need to do to adjust? Not just because I have my eye on the prize,
Mm-hmm.
the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
Mm-hmm.
everybody who sits in the same chair as we do must have some consideration and concern for the
Mm-hmm.
ultimate outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's the path we take to get there that is so critical. And your thinking about the path seems to be that if I help them construct a commonly understood and accepted pathway, they will undoubtedly find their way to the outcome that genuinely makes sense to them in the end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We trust
Which,
that.
yes, and that is definitely my belief, and that does include the possibility that they decide that it doesn't matter, like in other words, they don't reach an agreement at the end, and that's also fine. But you're right. In other words, like those, I liked the way you framed that sort of some of those questions that you asked, and I was sort of thinking how on my own, just as that, using the one, I think you said, what questions do you have for me? And I was just thinking how that's a journey for most mediators as they're sort of developing their skills, sort of a skill set, and especially that capacity for, rather than making statements, asking questions, but then even refining how the questions are being, asked. And we've all, along the way, most of us have some training where someone says, there's a difference between an open-ended and a closed-ended question, that kind of a thing. Well, that's where you start seeing the rubber in your practice sort of hit the road, where you say, do you have any questions for me? And they say no, or they say yes, and then they look at you, and then you realize that wasn't the most elegant way that I could have asked that it would have been more appropriate for me to ask that as an open-ended question like you would. And so to me, those things, eventually you have those little learnings along the way, and it's an accumulation of all those little things that come to bear as we continue to mediate. But hopefully, and I think this is maybe where it comes back to, which I know is dear to your heart, the reflective practice. Because I think as we go along, one of our dangers are especially operating sort of solo and not getting feedback and being able to truly be reflective, is that we reinforce bad habits. And so I think that's also a lot of the sort of the challenge is, how do we make sure that what we're doing, we may still be getting good results, but that we're not actually necessarily growing and discovering ways in which we could improve our practice. But that just simple little example like that, in other words, where we could continue just to keep asking closed-ended questions at a time that isn't actually as appropriate for us to do it as it would be to ask an open-ended question. But it's through reflection and opening ourselves up to feedback that we start to get those insights.
And what you just said, clearly, I agree with you
Mm-hmm.
completely. But one of the things that you said is that yes, we can't. There are mediators out there who get great results.
Mm-hmm.
If what you mean by result is a signed settlement agreement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think you take the view that there is more. There is something in addition to, but not necessarily, but certainly not more important than the signed settlement agreement, just in addition to it. And that's because you believe that, it helps you frame the behaviors that you use and the way in which you set up the mediation.
Well, just on that, I'd also say I think a lot depends on the context in which we're mediating, because my focus as I said early on, upstream, away from the courthouse, what I really come to appreciate is that I'm doing, it's like a relational model of mediation. And so even though the participants will get to the end and there'll be some kind of an agreement, it's not so much like a settlement agreement as it is really more just an articulation of the commitments that the two folks are making to one another. So when I think of I suppose those kind of relational mediations, I think you're right that in many ways I would say it's a little like this this quote, or I don't know what it is really, but someone I once heard saying, the map is not the territory. So you can be lost and you've got a map in your hand, and it's realizing that I'm looking at the map and I still don't know where I am, but I found that a helpful insight. And I'll sometimes say to people, the agreement is not the relationship. So you can have an agreement and you can say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But that's just a piece of paper. So in that sense, you're right. My emphasis is much more, especially in what I would call relational mediation, is much less in the agreement. In other words, I really couldn't care if they have an agreement if their relationship hasn't been addressed. I'm more concerned on the quality of how they're relating, and that sometimes it's helpful for them to have an agreement that gives them pointers and a map in terms of how they're going to navigate that relationship. But I don't lose sight that the most important thing is not the piece of paper, but actually their relationship. And so I'm more focused on that. But I will say though that for most of my experience in the workplace is that it very seldom do people sort of dig their heels in and say, I refuse to work something out with a particular colleague, because there are other sort of factors that come to bear in the workplace that motivate people to work something out. In other words, imagine you're working with someone else and you're not getting along, and someone internally in HR sort of speaks to the two of you and sees what she can do to help, and you're still not getting along, and now they bring in an external professional mediator, and at the end of that, you're still not getting along. The writing's sort of getting, it's going up on the wall, and most employees are going to realize this is not a good thing. And so that, though, actually sometimes is a worry for me, is that they're going to be too motivated to just patch things up and to work something out because of the economic sort of forces at play, like what it means to lose a job. And so they'll just pretend that the relationship has been healed and is doing better, when it actually hasn't. And that's actually a reason, and this was something that I slowly developed as a way of expressing myself, is that I'll often, during that orientation that I was telling you about, as I'll use this analogy of someone who's fallen on a spike and needs to have stitches as a matter of emergency. So their friend rushes them off to the emergency room, and they get onto the table and they're about to stitch them up, and the person realizes that they haven't, the wound hasn't been cleaned out. Whenever I share that with people, everyone agrees that even though it's going to be painful to clean out that wound, before we stitch it up, that's necessary. And I say, well, it's the same with our conflicts. If we just want to patch things up and move on and pretend it's all over and just do the stitching, which I often sort of liken to the agreement, and we haven't cleaned out the relational wound, then we're going to have a problem. And that's one of the ways in which I motivate people to have the conversation about their feelings and how they've been impacted as a human being, and see if we can sort of have what I typically try to have one dedicated session that's focused on them acknowledging one another's experiences, not agreeing with it, but just acknowledging that was what it was like for you, and that was what it was like for you. And I find that more than anything, I think, is maybe the sort of my acid test in terms of whether to me it's more important seeing and witnessing them there reconcile in a real human way than them coming up with some kind of a document that indicates who's going to do what. Because again, as I keep saying, the agreement is not the relationship. And so I keep my sights more solely, or not exclusively, but I am focused on the relationship. And just to say, though, that said, I don't see the agreement as a waste of time either, because there's a lot of value in that, the certainty that they get, that they have something they can go back to as a reference point in terms of how they're going to interact with one another in the future.
Well, and it seems to me, and we may not have, we may have to do a second conversation, John, to get into this, because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, the work you do often involves people who are in an ongoing relationship with one another through their employment. They could be coworkers or a supervisor and employee. And some folks watching this would say, but I mediate in situations where people don't want to have a future relationship. They want to just bring something to an end. It is about dollars, or it is about some act or performance, which for them would end. What I'm thinking is that for everybody who goes through mediation, this is my view.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm interested to see how closely this might track your own perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That for everybody who goes through a mediation process, there are a variety of elements that need to come to bear for
Mm-hmm.
there to be a proper ending. Let's call it an ending and not a
Mm-hmm.
settlement or
Mm-hmm.
solution.
Mm-hmm.
And that the balance among them is going to be very different depending on the parties, depending upon the context, depending upon the nature of the dispute itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that in some situations, participants might be much more concerned about the outcome, the result,
Mm-hmm.
the settlement, a
Mm-hmm.
dollar amount, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But even in those situations, there are relational matters that may have to do with how you get to the dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And there also is the relational matter of how each person engages and participates in the mediation process. That
Mm-hmm.
it may be just the relationship with themselves, not necessarily the relationship with somebody. So I'm thinking that we could take the model that you've described, and the emphasis might be greater on relationship in the work you do
Mm-hmm.
and less so in other areas, but that doesn't mean it disappears.
Yes, no, I would agree. I would agree, and I think so again. And I think that's where I've developed my model or my approach in my unique environment, and that I've tweaked and adjusted based on the feedback that I've got, reflecting on my understanding of conflict theory and sort of things like that. And I don't want to certainly prescribe or say folks operating in another arena where it's much more transactional, where at least at the surface it appears much more about the issue and less about the relationship, that everything would translate lock, stock, and barrel in terms of what I'm sharing. But I also would agree with you that there still remains that truth that beneath those business issues, there's always the fact of the matter that there's a human being driving that perception of whatever is going on, and it takes a different kind of tact to engage with those participants. But I would still suggest, though, there's still that same opportunity for empowering them and meeting them where they are to have their successful conversation, which may or may not lead to a resolution or not, and it would still constitute, I think, as we would both say, as a successful mediation.
Yeah, and what I experience is that what you've talked about um, is a framework that is solid and secure in its foundation,
Mm-hmm.
belief system that you have,
Mm-hmm.
but that is malleable and
Yes.
responsive to the circumstances and to the people involved. That it isn't a rigid structure that people go through from this to this to this to the next and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, no, I would fully agree. I think that as mediators, we're constantly sort of showing up and meeting our reality. It's never, there's always a surprise, like where you didn't quite expect this or that. Like, I think I recently did a mediation where I was expecting two, and each side showed up with a whole sort of entourage.
Sure, right.
I realized, if I resisted them and their commitment that they each had made, all these individuals to come to this mediation, I'd have gotten to a horrible sideshow, and things wouldn't have worked out. But I adjusted. Just to quickly make another quick little comment about another way in which I suppose I do things a little differently from what I would see as the classic legal mediations, has been shifting away from sort of starting at 9 o'clock in the morning until going until the evening until we get an agreement. So again, I think in some contexts that's an appropriate strategy of how to use the time and to manage just all of the logistics of getting people in the room and things like that, and also that it makes sense for those transactional kind of disputes. I find for my more relational mediation model, it's a little bit more like couples counseling, but I'll have a series of meetings, normally once a week for about 2 to 3 hours. And I found that just is another way in which I've adjusted, and that works. And then every now and then I'll get someone that says, no, we don't want to do that. We just want to have we're willing to spend 4 hours, sponsor 4 hours of your time to support our 2 employees do something. And then I don't say, well, I can't work like that. I then adjust and I meet that reality and do my best in that context. But even in that context, I'll have a shorter version of my orientation opening, but I'll still do that same educational spiel, as it were, to get them on the same page and give them some language to sort of think about what they're about to experience. And again, hoping that they'll be able to be more active and engaged participants.
And not because it's the way you always do it. It's because the way you do things was carefully thought through.
Well, and that's, yes, and you keep coming back to that, and I think for you, I sense it might be more crystal, like in other words, where there may be these crystal clear moments. The way I'd see it for myself, that it's just been a continuous refinement over time, just a continual adjustment of my process based on my experience, and then also, as we were discussing, that the fundamental requirement that we keep meeting our reality, no matter what we may have anticipated it to be, that we have to keep adjusting. But between that adjustment and that continual learning, and I'm sure the way it's going to be in the future is going to be different. But for now, it is the way it is, and it's been working. But I suppose what I'm really signaling is that I'm open to keeping on learning.
And that is a brilliant place for us to stop for this conversation.
Good.
And with the hope that we have many more, John.
Thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.